Hey friends, welcome to the end of the year prayer of Examen. So each year in the month of December, we set aside some time together to sort of lean deeper into reflection on our shared common commitments, the rhythms of bodily labor, prayer, study, and rest, as well as the 12 commitments that make up our rule of life. Together, this all makes up our rule of life. And so I was recently having a conversation with a pastor in another city, and this pastor is familiar with the concept of a rule of life, but probably perhaps thinks a little bit differently to how I've kind of come to understand this. This pastor was sharing with me that they have three things in their rule of life, and that before adding anything more to his rule of life, he wanted to make sure that he was doing these three things really well. And it was a really interesting conversation that opened up when I told him that the order has 4 rhythms and 12 commitments as part of our rule of life. And we had a brief conversation about some of how we think about the rule of life in the order. And I sort of graciously pushed a little on this framework of a rule of life being something that makes it feel like you've got to get these 3 things in place before adding something new. Like, I didn't have this analogy at hand in that conversation, but as I've reflected on it a little bit, one of the things that has come to mind is something like a workout routine. And this sort of draws, of course, on the idea of asceticism from the Greek word askesis, which has this sense of like a spiritual workout or training. So in a healthy workout routine, you have some exercises that are meant to be fairly broad in terms of what they do for your body. So you would want to have exercises that sort of target all of the areas of your body, strength building and flexibility, maybe eating well as part of your workout routine. And you would have all sorts of exercises that you attend to, and over time, these would give your body the kind of shape that you want to work out different areas of your body, recognizing that there may be some areas of your body that are like weaker than others. Like, you might need to lift lighter weights in one particular body part than you would another. Maybe you're like a strong runner, for example, but your upper body is a little weak. Or maybe you have like one particular exercise that feels really strong for you, but when it comes to flexibility, you recognize that you haven't put the time into being flexible. So I'm sure I'm losing many of you in this analogy, but it's the one I have like right now. So here's what I'm getting at. And I think it reveals maybe some faulty thinking around this conversation of rule of life. A rule of life, by definition, is really meant to provide structure for your spiritual life. But we're never really asking the question, have I perfected one particular commitment? Or am I doing this one commitment good enough so that I can add another one? That would be sort of like wanting to make sure that one particular muscle group was fully formed before beginning to train another muscle group. And I think about rule of life a little differently. So we have this broad range of practices and commitments to be broadly attentive so that we're developing a broad basis of infrastructure that holds and shapes our life. But friends, we're not trying to master anything. We're not trying to perfect one particular practice before moving on to another area. And of course, we don't want to neglect anything in our rule of life. So wherever you are in your process of formation, what we're working towards is helping you to eventually develop what we would call a customary, which allows you to get a little bit more granular to our practices. So if you're sort of wondering where some of this is headed, our formation is intentionally really slow with you, but this is where we're headed. Eventually, we'll be helping you think through some really concrete ways that you specifically might want to be living into our shared commitments. So for example, we have a shared commitment to the simplicity in food, and for some of us, that might include some practices of feasting, and others it might include some practices of fasting. So part of my own customary is that on Mondays I fast, and on one other day of the week I take a 30-minute walk, and I'm just intentional about being by myself and pushing back on some little part of me that's always sort of lived with what would maybe be called a poverty mentality, this idea that there's never going to be enough. So once a week, I take my love for food really seriously, and I buy myself lunch. It's never anything extravagant. It's usually like a $13 bowl of noodle soup. But this practice of intentional sort of leaning into something I love around food, it actually takes on a greater meaning for me because it's become part of my customary. It's one of the ways that I lean into a simplicity of relationship with food, sometimes through fasting and sometimes through feasting. These external practices do something internally for me. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this primarily because this month we're asking you to spend some time reviewing our rule of life, not to grade yourself or to judge yourself about whether or not you're doing a good enough job. The question is really this, like, where, God, are you meeting me in my rhythms and commitments? And where, God, would you like to meet me in this next year? Is there any invitation in this next year that you would like to invite me into? So you may remember last December, I shared a little bit about sensing some invitation around my relationship with technology. And I made some adjustments in this year, but I'm actually sensing again that there's something about the way that I engage with technology that feels like far too distracting to me. It feels like a vice. It still very much feels like there's something getting in the way, and that God is inviting me yet again into a deeper simplicity with technology. But here's where I'd like to return to this conversation that I was having with this pastor. I don't need to fix my relationship with technology, which sort of feels like a weak muscle for me. I don't need to fix that before giving some attention to some other things in my life. Like, I don't need to conquer one commitment before moving on to another. So I may be in for a season of renewed focus on my relationship to technology, but the way that a rule of life is meant to work is to allow my life as it currently is to sort of be set next to the rule, and to allow the rule, or the straight edge, this ruler, to reflect back to me some data about my life around God's invitations to me. So there's no need to be perfect. Like, the purpose of a rule of life is to reflect back and to allow God's Spirit to woo us into deeper engagement with God's invitations. So over this next month, I'd love for you to sit with really two questions in reflection and prayer as you come into your community formation group. First is this: over the past year, where have you seen God work in your life as it relates to one or more of our rhythms or commitments? Like, how has God already been at work in you? Even more specifically, where have you experienced the love of God in this formational journey? And I'm gonna say that part again, because this is where I'd really like for us to lean into. Where are you experiencing the love of God in our rhythms and our shared commitments? So listen, really practically, I know some of you have just finished up the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Many of you have spent the past 9 months, maybe the first half of 2022, and that entire journey of the spiritual exercises is a journey of prayer. So for 9 months, you've leaned into our rhythm of prayer in a particular way. And the question is, how has God been at work in that? And since finishing up the exercises, how has God continued to be at work in your rhythm of prayer? This would just be an example. I know I have heard many of you talk about feeling sort of pulled into some deepening commitments to formational healing, or the study of Scripture. This year-end examen is meant to help you have some time to reflect on how the rhythms and the commitments that you've been leaning into, what has it been like for you? How has God met you in this process? So it's both a looking back, but it's also like a looking forward to the invitations of God. So that's the second question. Where do you sense God's invitations for you to lean a little bit deeper into some of the commitments that you've made with our rule of life? Is there anything that you're feeling God's invitation towards? These two things, this looking back and this looking forward with attentiveness, is really a way of asking this ongoing question: God, what do you want to do in my life? And how can I participate with you in my life, in the practices and the commitments of my life, in order to join that invitation from you? That's it, friends. Spend some time this month, maybe do some journaling, some praying with a couple of questions that we have for you below, and then come into your formation group with something to say, something to share about what you would like to say out loud about God's work in your life this year, and what you are hopeful for, or what you are experiencing as an invitation moving forward. Okay, much love and grace to you.